You write in The Sickness is the System that you were educated at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, and that not once in all that time studying economics did a professor have you read Marx and his critique of capitalism. And when I read this, I thought, this is totally ridiculous, because even if you're an ardent capitalist, you've got to be able to defend your theory against objections, or at least understand its merits relative to alternatives. And I'm not a trained economist or well-versed in the field's culture. So what I was wondering is how it happened that Marx was relegated to philosophy or English departments and ignored by the economists.
I think the answer to that is really quite simple. In my time as a university student, and I can extend it basically to the present because I went from being a student to being a professor of economics, and that's what I've done most of my life. The answer to the question is the Cold War. In the Second World War, roughly 1941 to 1945, the United States was officially allied with the Soviet Union. Being a Marxist at that time was considered to be a badge of your loyalty. It was understood that the German Nazi regime, Hitler and all of that, had hunted down and murdered huge numbers of communists, socialists, Marxists. So nothing could be more reliable as an opponent of fascism, which the United States was fighting in Germany, Italy, and Japan, than Marxists. And, if we had time, I'd give you the name of 100 Marxists that were active in the United States that went to work at the highest levels of the United States government because they were trusted. They became important people doing work for the war effort. At the end of the war, 1945, there was a dramatic about-face. With the fascist enemy gone, the Germans were defeated, the Italians were defeated, the Japanese were defeated. The American business community decided they were not at all happy with an alliance with the Soviet Union and with the fact that Marxist, socialist, communists were actively doing their things all over the United States because they were trusted allies. And so we had a purge. There's no other way to put it. Sometimes it's called the Cold War. Sometimes it's called McCarthyism. Now, that was the name of a senator from Wisconsin who hunted down socialists, Marxists, communists, wherever they were, in the university, in the labor movement, in government, and brought them up in the glare of publicity, had them say that they were socialists or trapped them in questions and got them fired. It's happened in other countries. It happened there. So all of this happened particularly in the second half of the 1940s, right after the war, and into the 1950s. What it did particularly was to purge colleges and universities. Marxists, leftists were thrown out of their jobs, either because they didn't have tenure, or many of them who had tenure simply had the university ignore the tenure and fire them. So, for example, when I got to Harvard College, I looked around because I was interested for Marxists. I wanted to see, could I find a Marxist professor at Harvard in anything. I didn't care what the subject matter was. And I very quickly discovered as a naive freshman that either there weren't any, or if they were there, they were scared to be known to be such. It turned out some years later, as I got to be active at Harvard and know people, that I found there were a handful of them, but they were eager not to be so identified. You might be interested to know that one of the people I found was a professor of mathematics, as it happened, not at Harvard, but next door at MIT. Both MIT and Harvard are located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They're short distance from each other, one or two stops on the subway. So I got to work with him, a man named Dirk Struick, a widely published, tenured professor. I heard about Noam Chomsky in the language department and so on, and I got to know some of them. I met Herbert Marcuse, who was teaching at Brandeis. But there were a handful like that. If you found your way into that circle, which I did, you had some interaction. Most young people like me, and there were plenty of them, who were interested in the left intellectually, never found their way into those circles. I did. That's a story about my parents, who are Europeans. English is my third language. I grew up speaking French and German. It's a different story. And it was for those reasons that I had entree into those circles. Marcuse was a German, Struick was a Scandinavian, and so on. But the truth of it is, my professors were scared. I would raise my hand at Harvard, but the same thing happened at Stanford, and then the same thing happened at Yale. I spent 10 years of uninterrupted schooling at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. I'm a poster boy for elite education in this country, and all I can tell you is you can fit into a very small room the number of professors I found who knew about Marx, who were comfortable and secure enough to teach about Marx or to answer students' questions. Here's the thing, the experience that happened to me most often. I'd raise my hand. I'd ask a question. And the question had would come either into Marxism or into socialism or into worker revolutions, stuff like that. And I could see in the professor's face the silent pleading, don't go there. And this is teachers who I liked and teachers who I didn't like. So it really had nothing to do with that. But they would say, oh, I'm not so sure, or that's not an area of my interest. But their eyes were saying, could you please go somewhere else with this question? Or if you have to stay with it, could you come to my office hours and we can talk? You know, I'm not stupid. I could see, I had no interest in embarrassing these professors or making their life hard. That was not my interest. So I would stop and, I would accommodate the discomfort that was written on their faces so any child could have seen it. Long story short, together with other young students like myself, I went and found teachers outside of those three institutions, or the students together, we had little study groups and we would read the relevant literature and discuss it. That's how I learned Marxism. I didn't learn it from these institutions. I learned it despite these institutions. And in one part of your question, I would like to add, it's not a sign of intellectual greatness to exclude Marxism. It's not a sign of confidence, and it's not smart. It is, to be blunt, stupid, because you do need to know at least a little bit how other people think differently from you, especially if they have nuclear weapons. And it is kind of dumb. And it's a dumbness that is hurting this country and has throughout my life. The befuddlement of American leaders, for example, dealing with Xi Jinping and other leaders in China today. That befuddlement is not because the Chinese people are hard to read. No, and nothing, they may be, I don't know. I don't deal with Chinese people very much. but I seriously doubt that they are anything other than just like you and me. The rest is a stereotype. But here's what I know. The American leaders dealing with them have no clue about the mental formation of people raised in a Marxist tradition of literature. And I'll give you one concrete example. My classmate at Yale, which is where I got my PhD in economics, one of my classmates sitting in the same room, reading the same reading list, listening to the same professor, was a woman, and there were very few women then in economics, but that woman's name, Janet Yellen. I know what she knows because she and I were taught literally by the same professors in the same room at the same time. Yet what comes out of her mouth, I know, is different from what she understands, unless the intervening years have erased from her mind vast material. But I don't believe that's happened. She's a perfectly nice person, nothing to do with any of that. She just doesn't know about this whole. No one at Yale ever taught her, and she did not have whatever it takes to go find it out on her own. And so she lives in a bubble, imagining that everybody else is in a bubble. It's remarkable.